Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for joining this Stockholm+50 associated event. It is jointly organized by the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, the United Nations Environment Programme, with generous support from Canada's International Development Research Centre. My name is David Passarelli. I am the Executive Director of UNU-CPR, and together with my co-lead Adam Day, we would like to extend a very warm welcome to colleagues in the UN and international policy community that have made time to join us today as discussants to engage with the ideas in the collection of papers that we have organized for this side event. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our 12 contributing authors. They are a remarkably diverse group. I cannot do justice to their backgrounds and the contributions they have already made to this field. So I will invite you all to look at the event page to read more about their bios. We also have the great pleasure of inviting two members of the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. To my right, Nanjala Nyabola, and to my left, Poonam Gamire. Thank you both for making the time to attend this event. And last but not least, thank you to all of you, our attendees, who have made time to join today's side event. We have an active chat box for this event. We're going to encourage you to engage with our authors, with us in the chat box, ask questions, react to the presentations. Everyone will be monitoring the chat box and will be trying to engage with you in that space. So please don't wait until the end of the event to ask us questions and to share your thoughts. I'd like to say a few words very briefly just to frame this event and to introduce this initiative. The purpose of our project was really to instigate a reflection on today's environmental crises, but more importantly, to reflect on our relationship with the environment. UNU, the United Nations University, and UNA wanted to explicitly create a space to foreground alternative, transformative paradigms to recast the human-environment relationship. It's resulted in 12 papers, a really rich collection that covers a wide range of ideas. I think the most common current through all the papers is that we live in an indivisible ecological community. That's quite clear from all our authors, and I think it's a concept and a reality that has become more accepted in certain academic circles, but it's also clear from recent summits and political gatherings that we have simply not made the necessary strides in policy, platforms, and practice to action this reality. And it was this challenge that was at the forefront of our minds when we designed this initiative several months ago. We acknowledged from an early moment late last year that it would not be enough to be inclusive at Stockholm+50, to invite a diversity of views to the event itself. That would be too late to engage with alternative ideas and paradigms. So instead, we designed a process where we would invite thinkers to engage with the lead-up process, the policy process that led up to the event itself. We've seen engagement from our authors in 3 leadership dialogue tracks organized by the UN Environment Programme and regional consultations. And we're delighted to see that many of the ideas that our authors have put forward have been reflected in the outcome documents of those leadership tracks. I'm not going to go through all of the ways that those leadership outcome documents have picked up on the ideas from our authors group, but perhaps I can surface a few. We have, for example, recommendations from our African environmental philosopher Workine Kelbesa, who has encouraged the integration of a broader range of environmental ethics in education programs for youth, including African environmental ethics. In Leadership Dialogue 3, they have embraced recommendations from Louis Kotze on the creation of an Earth Systems Law, from Elena Bennett and her co-author Belinda Ryers, looking at multi-scalar analysis and embracing really uncertainty and complexity in our engagement with environmental policy. And also, they've picked up on recommendations from Maritza Paredes on the role of civil society in holding governments accountable. The goal of today's conversation and the 2 hours that we'll be spending together is to extend that conversation between our authors and the policy community. We want to give our invited discussants an opportunity to reflect on the ideas in the papers that we've connected and to speak to ways that those ideas can still shape and impact UN policy processes today for governments, the multilateral community, for cities, and for citizens. So we look forward to a really rich discussion with everyone that's come together. And I will stop there and I will invite our colleague and guest, Nanjala Nyabola, to offer a few framing remarks before I turn over to our moderator for today's discussion, our collaborator and a co-editor of these papers, Margot Larbet. Nanjala, over to you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Very happy to be here with you all today. I have to preface my remarks by saying environment is not my core work, but I really am excited to be part of this panel because it touches on something that I've been thinking about, and I think that many people are trying to think about, but it's kind of forcing the conversation on us before it gets too late. So by way of reference, I work a lot on digital technology and the intersection between technology and politics. And one phenomenon that recurs in the conversation about the role that technology will play in our lives in the future is this idea of techno-solutionism and this idea of throwing technology to solve deeply complex social and political problems instead of conducting the deep engagement with the urgent questions, with the social questions, with the political questions, and indeed with the environmental questions that that are implicated in those solutions or in those problems. And so I wanted to use my framing remarks to center on one particular aspect of techno-solutionism that I think touches on the themes of this panel, which is reflecting on not different paradigms of engaging with the natural environment. And specifically in the realm of technology, we are very much concerned with future-proofing and thinking about, using technology to secure our future. But one thing that really does come up in this particular conversation is how does the natural environment fit in with our concepts of future-proofing, especially when we're deploying technology without thinking about context. So the one issue that, I've been and I want to put on the table in this conversation is the idea of cryptocurrencies. At the moment, as we speak, various countries are embracing cryptocurrencies as a solution to digital inclusion, to limited banking facilities, to, El Salvador has gone ahead and made Bitcoin its official currency as a way of insulating this is the official argument, is a way of insulating people from economic shock that comes with having a very fluid currency that fluctuates extremely depending on the political context. Nigeria and Kenya are two developing countries that are also planning stable coins Nigeria has actually launched the e-Naira, which is a digital wallet that is supposed to eventually become a digital cryptocurrency. As all of these, in 2018, the UN described cryptocurrencies as one of the solutions that would be put forward, again, to solve all of these complex problems of digital inclusion, of financial inclusion, and indeed bringing financial services to the unbanked poor. The thing is, cryptocurrencies have a tremendous environmental impact. In the US alone, 40 billion pounds of carbon emissions can be attributed directly to cryptocurrencies. Each Bitcoin transaction produces 2,100 kilowatt hours or consumes 2,100 kilowatt hours of energy, or the equivalent of one US household in 75 days. And the United States is already one of the highest consumers of energy in the world. Of course, at this time, most of that energy is coming from fossil fuels because of the nature of the energy of the countries that are conducting some of this mining. 97.2 megatons, or roughly the annual emissions of Argentina, is produced by Bitcoin alone, which is one of many cryptocurrencies that are out there. That's the equivalent of Sweden's, where we are, annual emissions. So when people talk about future-proofing and using cryptocurrency as one of the methods of future-proofing our economies and future-proofing our political economic spaces, then we have to wonder, what are the environmental implications of this techno-solutionist approach? What are we missing? And obviously the key thing is it will reset our relationship to the natural environment and accelerate consumption at a rate in which we're not really prepared to deal with. And yet the absence of this particular narrative in thinking about the role that crypto will play in our digital futures says something about what we think nature represents in our future. It says something about how we have framed consumption over a healthy relationship, over a synergy with the natural environment. And so I'm really excited to hear this panel and to hear some of the contributors to this paper talk about shifting some of these paradigms, because I think the way in which consumption is framed, certainly in the digital space, doesn't do an adequate job of thinking through the implications that our choices will have for the natural environment. And that's before we even get into batteries and green energy and that impact of the consumption of lithium on lithium batteries on mining communities, and the shifts that are happening, political shifts that are happening in places like Eastern Congo because of this growing hunger for coltan. And so I'm excited to hear the papers look fantastic. I'm excited to hear the panelists' submissions on this. And I hope that we're kind of moving towards a place where when we say the environment is a cross-cutting theme in all the work that we do, we can actually walk the walk on that. And it just doesn't remain as an abstract commitment, but we're actually shifting the paradigms and moving ourselves away from these harmful techno-solutionist approaches towards holistic use of technology and thinking about our shared digital futures. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nanjala, for those very thoughtful remarks. We will now turn over to Margot Larbet, who will be our Master of Ceremonies and will be guiding us through the program today. Margot, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those initial framing remarks. I really think that sets us up really quite nicely to really grapple with these important themes and the cross-cutting themes of these papers. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the experts today and from the authors themselves. And to get us started, we have Daniel Perel, who is the representative of the Baha'i International Community to the UN. So Daniel, please take the floor.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, David and Adam, for putting this together. And thank you especially to the fine authors of these papers. I received them slowly while I was abroad and on different continents. And as they came in, I kept saying, oh, I'll maybe read one or two, but I couldn't just read one or two. They were really fascinating, such diverse contributions, different perspectives, from different areas of expertise. And I'm really grateful to the UNU team for putting together such a wonderful diversity of contributions. As you know, one of my favorite analogies, and unfortunately I use many, is that of the blind man and the elephants. Each of them describes it differently, but it's all one thing. And as I was reading these papers, I was saying, oh yes, everybody's describing a different dimension of this problem that we're trying to approach. And with the elucidation of all of these perspectives, we get a really more complete picture, I found, of what we're dealing with and sort of the imagination and the creativity that's necessary at this moment in history. Of all these papers, I think the two that perhaps spoke to me most directly were from Professor Kushil Watene, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name, and also from Dr. Iyad Al-Mogli. So I'll focus my contributions on those two. And forgive me, I'm not an academic, so I don't quite know how to offer responses, but I'll do my best. In Watene's paper, I found this idea of the time scale to be so vital. We speak all the time about these political cycles, and we need to think more long term, and all of this makes sense read rhetorically, but it was really put into sort of a practical and a lived reality as she was describing the indigenous traditions and how they, at least from a Maori context, were understanding present and future generations. I was thinking about this idea of YOLO, this phrase popular in American pop culture, you only live once, and it's sort of understood as, just do whatever you want, you only get one chance. But I found that this paper turned YOLO on its head and said, you only live once, you better do it right. Because future generations they have the power. That was another interesting dimension I'll touch on in a moment, but they have the power to define our legacy. And I thought that conception of YOLO was really wonderful. It wasn't articulated that way. That's, Dan's own ridiculous reading. So I also found this idea of untelling the harmful narratives that dominate the modern discourse to be super important, because it's not just about creating something new, it's about acknowledging the ways that we've been a little bit wayward and untelling that in order to retell something a little bit more constructive. As referenced earlier, this idea of future generations holding the power, I found to be really remarkable. At this very moment, UN Foundation is putting on an event about future generations, and I wish I could split myself in two. But that event, it was often the rhetoric there is often saying future generations don't have a voice, so we have to speak for them. They don't have power in these halls, but we do. And this paper was saying, actually, if done right, they have all the power because they're in our hearts at all times. And so, and our legacy, as mentioned earlier, is defined by them. And so it turns this whole narrative on its head where we are powerless in light of the future and they are the powerful. I thought that was really a wonderful framing. And if that can come with us into these spaces, it would be fascinating. And this quote here, by facing our descendants, we are prompted to cultivate the courage to undertake innovation and action in pursuit of collective well-being and justice. That was just beautiful. The last thing I'll say on this paper is this other quote where she says, while long-term thinking is important, innovation is not to be found by adopting only a forward-looking orientation. Flexibility is likely to involve looking to the past for guidance to find value in understanding how opportunities and challenges were navigated. I think the word how there is so important because it's not necessarily what they did, but how they did it that we can learn from. What were the processes? How were they inclusive? How did they hear the appropriate voices? How did they bring people together? Because what they did may be different temporally, but how they did it, I think, is quite significant. And this then brings up Dr. Ian's paper, which focuses, of course, on the role of religion. And if we're going to look at the past to understand the future, religion, having been around for millennia, seems to be a pretty helpful area to turn to. And what I was thinking as I was reading Dr. Ian's paper was that this is just a wonderful explication of what religion can and does offer to humanity, what it offers both in terms of its personal motivation, its community building capacity, and even its own financial and kind of programmatic dimensions. One thing that I was thinking about as I was reading it, one basic question that it raised for me in terms of further exploration is that the terminology in the paper generally refers to faith-based organizations, faith actors, or religions. And it's valuable and important conceptually to understand their role. But I was also thinking, what role does religion as a notion, as a system of knowledge, have as a force in shaping society? And I think the way, to make this more practical, what if the SDGs were treated like the Bible or the Quran? The Quran can motivate people to do amazing things, both amazing great and amazing tragic. What if documents produced by the UN had that same power of motivation? How have religions used rhetoric on paper to inspire people to do fantastic, life-sacrificing things, both in good and bad ways? I'm not applying any judgment, just that power, that how is so important. I'll try to wrap up. I know I've been speaking for a while, but moving beyond GDP, the multilateral environmental agreements and their implementation would benefit, I think, from a deeper understanding of how, again, religion inspires us to act. And Dr. Ian's paper highlights this. And then the last thing I want to just talk about is this idea of science and religion, which Dr. Ian articulates, that often science treats religion as sort of a lesser system of knowledge. It's less hard, I suppose, and religion is this softer cousin. But I was reading it and I was thinking, actually, there are a number of articles of faith. If you look at the philosophy of science, which has evolved over the course of centuries, there are a number of articles of faith that scientists themselves have. And then there are also a number of scientific approaches that faith-based communities have. The faith-based science approach, I would say, over the course of generations, what works and what doesn't is a much longer term experiment, so to speak. And then the articles of faith of science are perhaps less well understood, but they are no less present. And so this isn't a dichotomy where you have science or religion. These are both systems of knowledge that can elucidate sort of the human experience on both the physical level through science and the metaphysical level through religion. And the more we can explore these two and how they interact with each other, not as distinct areas of exploration, but as sort of a conversation, I think that the more dimensions we'll have to understand the broad picture of the human endeavor at this moment. So thank you to all the authors, to David and Adam, UNU, and especially to Dr. Watene and Dr. Abumogli. Thanks so much.
Thank you for those very thoughtful interventions. It's clear that you, like all of us, have really been grappling with these key themes, and you've touched on a lot of really key points. And I think one key point that you mentioned, and a lot of these papers mention, is the point on behavior change, right? I think from the opening comments and what's clear is that that's what's really so difficult here and why critical change has not happened. So looking at religion, looking at indigenous tradition and philosophy really helps us think about how can this behavior change? What's the power of religion to really influence people? And I think you really brought that point forward here. And thank you to you, and thank you for the authors who have really brought that. So next up, we have Poonam Gimir, who is a climate activist and Next Generation Fellow with the United Nations Foundation, a member of the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. So Poonam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to start by thanking you for inviting me to put some of my thoughts on reimagining human-environment relationship. And today, I'd like to start with a statement that I picked from the papers by Dr. Day and Dr. Passeri, that facing a triple planetary crisis of warming planet, massive biodiversity loss and pollution, global leaders attending Stockholm+50 conference might see more as a funeral pyre to the ambition of 1972 and less as a celebration, and I can totally feel that. The recent IPCC reports indicate that human-driven global temperature rise are accelerating and will exceed the thresholds of 1.5 degree over the next 20 years, much earlier than originally anticipated, and challenges posed by the current deteriorating human-environment relationships and their impacts on human health, society, economy, and security, as well as biodiversity loss, is already well known. So today, I would like to highlight on a few key issues along with their solutions. One of the major issues of the current deteriorating human-environment relationship is the global inequality in resource use. There is an overexploitation of the common resources by the global north rather than the global south. And how can this challenge be overcome? By the active intervention of global north. I really second the proposal by Dr. Heckel that the high-income countries should scale down unnecessary form of production and consumption and reorganize the economy around the human well-being so that we not only achieve the ecological goals, but also achieve the social goals like global justice and international development. Another major challenge that the whole global system is facing, including the human-environment relationship, is the lack of diversity and inclusivity. There is an underrepresentation of women, youth, and indigenous people in the global decision-making. 70% of people living in poverty worldwide are women. 80% of people displaced by climate crisis are women. 70% of agricultural labor and water-related household chores are performed by women. However, the participation of women in the global climate governance is very low because of their low participation in politics, research, and media. Only 21% of global ministers are women, which ultimately leads to women to have far less access in the global high-level climate decision-making. So, yeah, and IPCC, the largest influencer of COP itself, has only around 30% of female authors. And how about youth? Youth are expected to have a long list of years of experience to participate as a government delegation, which we usually do not possess. So it's usually the civil society organizations and NGOs which favor the young voices and the voices of women and girls. So we see youth, girls, and women advocating outside and not making important decisions inside. So what could the solutions be? I believe that there can be no climate justice without gender justice. For every additional year of education that a girl receives, her country's climate disaster resilience improves. And estimates also suggest that together with family planning, girls' education has the potential to avoid nearly 85 gigatons of carbon emissions by 2050. And regarding youth, I would like to reference our Future Agenda report and propose the empowerment of young people as the designers of the sustainable future. And how can we do that? By supporting and listening to the young climate activists, responding to the demands of young youth climate movements like Fridays for Future, electing young sustainability envoys in every country so that they can work at the local, national, and international level climate decision making, supporting youth-led social entrepreneurship and nature-based solutions, drawing on indigenous and local knowledge, and so on and so on. I'm also the strong supporter of Marija Paredes' proposal of systematic integration of voices of indigenous people in the global governance policy, because indigenous people, despite being only 5% of global population, are protecting 80% of global biodiversity. So overall, the governments and institutions must increase the investment of empowerment of youth, women, and other underrepresented people in education, entrepreneurship, and politics, and promote diversity and inclusivity in all forms of the system. The global system also has to change the narrative from an economy-based and biased society towards the adaptation of science-based targets for all global governments by winning the hearts and minds of the people as the Global Government Alliance proposes. And we can't forget our own responsibilities as global citizens by adopting the eco-friendly lifestyle in food, transport, energy, and fashion. Yes, fashion, because fashion alone is the 10% of global greenhouse emitter. So much to do and so less time. So we must immediately and collectively start taking actions so that we don't fail the planet, our future generations, and other biodiversity that we as humans have responsibility towards. We should never forget that Earth is our common and the only home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Poonam, for those really excellent points. I think those 2 points in terms of inequality being a key issue here, in addition to inclusivity and diversity, are really critical. And a lot of the papers really point to this power structure and this power dynamic that has put us in this situation. And I think Professor Jason Hickel's paper really brings this point home in terms of what you've been mentioning, Poonam, in terms of the economic system that we have today, one that is really based on perpetual expansion or growth and these certain power dynamics. So I definitely hear these points and I see them in the papers as well. So thank you for those interventions. And next up, we have Yasmina Byrne, who is the Chief of Foresight and Policy from UNICEF. So Yasmina, please.
Thank you. Good morning, all, and good afternoon to those of you in Stockholm. I'm really happy to join this important gathering, and I'm really grateful to have had an opportunity to read these wonderful papers and to make some comments today from a policy perspective to some of the challenges that these papers address. Today, I will focus on two papers. The first one by Professor Crucial Vatene on indigenous philosophy and intergenerational justice, and the paper by Marita Paredes on socio-territorial voices for climate change in Andean Amazon. I hope I pronounced your names correctly. Apologies if I didn't. These two papers approach the issues of indigenous communities and environmental justice from two seemingly different but related viewpoints. Professor Vatene's paper focuses on the pursuit and realization of intergenerational justice contained in indigenous philosophies that are embedded in relationships between different species, and which, I quote here, stretch in both linear and lateral directions, extending backwards and forwards in time, as well as outward to include all things in the present. Professor Paredes writes about the importance of territorial justice and territorial movements in climate action in the global south, and recognizes the historical and contemporary characteristics of these territories. And she talks about acting towards the defense of livelihoods, related ecosystems, and local cultures. First of all, I want to say that I've learned a lot from both of these papers, and I'm really grateful for that. I've learned about the plight of indigenous populations related to the climate challenges and their philosophy and approaches to climate justice, which offer hope for the future. At the same time, these two papers in particular resonated strongly with me. First, I work for UNICEF, which is a UN children's fund, and we have a presence in 119 countries and territories, and some of the territories that are also mentioned in these papers. And we are increasingly witnessing in our organization and working with local communities challenges that indigenous populations face when it comes to climate change, the environmental degradation, loss of habitable territories, biodiversity loss, negative impact on indigenous people's livelihood and their culture. Children and young people from indigenous communities are disproportionately vulnerable to the impact of climate change, despite the fact that they have the minimal ecological footprint. One of the biggest challenges that indigenous populations can face is when their environment is endangered, that they have to leave these territories and migrate to other territories or even other countries. And when children move, particularly and young people, they and those from indigenous communities, they can experience intersectional discrimination, both as migrants but also as indigenous groups. This impact on climate change, on voluntary and involuntary migration of children and their families has led us to start this work on developing of the guiding principles on children on the move in the context of climate change that is nearly completed, and we work very closely with the UN University Center for Policy Research. These guiding principles actually put in the center children's rights, their best interest, non-discrimination, and they put in the center of climate mobility policy. The second reason why these two papers resonated with me was that children and young people, like some indigenous communities, lack voice and agency that the authors write about. Both Vatena and Paredes write about how indigenous communities are treated as passive recipients of social and environmental policy and reform rather than active agents capable of responding locally, contributing to agenda and policy setting globally. And this really strongly resonates with what young people tell us about their role and their ability to participate in decision-making process. Recently, we hosted an event with a young activist about climate justice, and they told us that they would like to influence decisions around climate policies and programming, including climate finance, but that they largely view their participation as tokenistic. They're invited to events and sometimes global events, but not really, they don't really have a seat at the table where policies are and regulations are being made. Third, the papers speak about power imbalance between the state and the indigenous community. And this particularly resonates because we also witness this power imbalance when it comes to children, young people, and the state. But I would also add at big corporations. This frayed social contract actually dates back to Enlightenment period when philosophers argued that children are not fully rational and lack the capacity to reach reasoned decisions, so they cannot be viewed as contracting partners to social contracts. Today, we use different arguments. Children cannot vote, so therefore they cannot have a voice in policy-making processes. However, this disproportionate impact of the climate crisis that we have on children and young people cannot be ignored any longer. And this is where I actually hope that using this indigenous people's wisdom can help us create stronger bonds between young people and their elders, young people and their descendants, young people and the state. they particularly, young people from indigenous communities particularly have a deep knowledge of their environment and understanding of appropriate prevention and adaptation measures to climate change, and how to, and they're increasingly getting mobilized and organized to voice their opinions about the situation. And as Secretary General's report, Common Agenda, calls for new social contract and recognition of our duties to future generation, I think we can apply this concept of facing that Vatena writes about, the notion of facing our ancestors, each other, and facing in descendants. And this notion can help actually add more layers to the understanding of what we owe to future generations. Likewise, the new social contract can expand to beyond just contract between the state and individual, but also to include horizontal relations and indigenous equality and justice, intergenerational equality and justice. So what can be done? The authors offer some policy solutions in their papers, including rethinking responsibilities, supporting local communities to take more active part in policymaking process, promoting innovation. To this, I would add that at a global level in particular, we need to ensure that the multilateral model of climate action becomes a multi-level and multi-stakeholder model that involves state and non-state actors. Perhaps we can learn here from other models and approaches to global public goods, such as the internet, though this multi-stakeholder model has not always worked in practice. But we can also learn from what didn't work when it comes to other global public goods. In her paper, Professor Vatena says we need to find the courage to completely transform and remake development infrastructures and policy making, and not only to be forward-looking, but also looking to the past for guidance. When it applies to multilateral system, this would require us, and here I mean UN, to be more agile, bold, and adaptable, and to base our action on past and emerging evidence, and our anticipation of the future and understanding this future. And then finally, I would say we need to tap into young people's potential. Their beliefs and desires for change could be a powerful driver. But young people need more than just the rhetoric. They need systemic support. They need funding for their organizations at the seat at the table, not only at conferences and panelists, though we're always grateful to have participation of young people in our panels. But we also need to have their presence in places where regulatory and financial decisions are made. In particular, we need a systemic support for indigenous young people's networks and organizations. And with this, I would just like to say that that intergenerational climate justice that these papers talk about needs to be grounded in our internationally accepted justice systems, human rights frameworks, and the rule of law. The duties we have to the nature, land, and the future generations are not only our moral imperatives, but also legal and developmental. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Yasmina, for those interventions. I'm really starting to hear a lot of key themes here. Again, as Poonam mentioned, how power imbalance between countries, and as you mentioned, Yasmina, corporations as well, is really a key issue here. And another key point is how important it is to include diverse voices in this human environment or relationship conversation, from Indigenous people to youth. And I think, we really see in these papers how it's a deeply human issue, and there's many different perspectives. And I think, Yasmina, you really brought that point home in terms of how important it is to really include these and support these diverse voices. So thank you. And next up, we have Dr. Pushpam Kumar, who is the Chief Economist at the UN Environment Program. So please, Dr. Kumar, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David, and colleagues from UNU for inviting me. Very pleased to be here. Margie, how much time do I have?
So I would say, 10 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That is good. So I read all the papers. And I found them really fascinating. But I was asked to comment upon 3-4 papers, primarily by Jason, by Janani, by Belinda Reyes, and Elena Bennett. So I would limit myself to those papers, but I would also touch upon tangentially some of the papers which I'm not going to comment specifically, but I think the essence, you will see that I'm trying to build up upon those papers as well. So we are meeting in Stockholm after 50 years of 1972 meeting. Whatever the problems were there in 72 are still there. It's not that in the last 50 years we have not achieved, we have not done much, but the problem has aggravated. We have heard from the Secretary General, from other officials of the UN, we are talking about the planetary crisis, primarily climate change, biodiversity, and pollution, and plastics, chemicals. So these are the three dimensions of the planetary crisis we are confronted with. So biodiversity, we all know that the various assessments are saying that we are losing them. Some of the, I mean, we know from IPBES that 1 million species are under risk. We also know that since 1950, that is the age of Anthropocene, mangrove has declined, coral has been bleached, topsoil has been eroded by more than half at a moderate to severe scale, of course. And of course, this varies across the continent. So, but I'm giving you the global pictures. Then wildlife has declined. So there is a problem there. On climate change, we know that we are not going to be within 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was the aspiration and commitment from Paris. In fact, anything is the real depiction. It has to be 3.5. If we want 1.5, there has to be a drastic cut in the emission. And we all know from our practical sense that it is not going to happen. There are promises through net zero, somebody talking 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070, but we know that they could be a lip service or in a way to deflect the people like us that we are doing something, but we know it is not enough. So that problem remains. Pollution is a problem, especially if you see the air pollution. There are various estimates coming from various groups and studies. The global, air pollution alone causes 9 million deaths. And if you translate this death and other damages through mortality and morbidity roads, it comes around 7% of the global GDP annual. So it's a big. One can go on and add, but from all the papers, there is enough reflection that there is a crisis. Number one, it's not that in last 50 or 100 years, we have not achieved much. If you start from 1950, of course, if you see GDP or material output has gone up by 15%. Of course, population has gone up by three times. Sorry, if I said 15%, 15 times. The output has gone up and the population has gone up by 3 times. So per capita output or the production has gone up by 5 times, so which is good. And we are doing many, life expectancy has improved. And I'm not given to the rosy scenario, people like Steve Pinkers and others, but nonetheless, there has been some achieved. But the problem is many of these achievements have been done at certain cost. And unfortunately, that cost has inflicted or damaged the nature in a significant way. And that is what we have already mentioned. Now, in that larger context, if we see the paper by Janani Vivekananda, Janani basically set the context and she talks about 5.5 pathways. that how, and of course, Jeremy's paper is mostly on the climate change and human security. And C basically brings the climate change and how it impacts the availability of resources and human security, food security. And then she goes on, as she adds that we need the comprehensive assessment of risk, we need to build capacity. And she also says that monitoring and evaluation should be in place in order to tackle that part. Then I think Jason comes out with very interesting finding. Jason says that the GDP, of course, is a problem, which I fully agree. Jason goes on saying that the green growth, the concept of green growth, which has been popular in last few years, that diffusion, deployment, and innovation can take care. Sadly, it is not happening. And then the Jason says that we need to talk about the colonial, ecological breakdown, and he comes to the issues of degrowth. Of course, he tries to answer some of the questions raised by skeptics, that whether degrowth can create enough output, enough job, and by taking the help of some evidences, Jason says, yes, it is possible. Jason very clearly talks about inequality, and he seems to suggest the environmentalism of the poor and the justice part he brings up very clearly in his paper. The third paper, which I was reading with a lot of interest, is by Elena Bennett and Belinda Reyes. So it's a fascinating paper too again. Then Elena and Belinda both are talking about how sustainable development in the age of Anthropocene is possible, or what are the issues. And they emphasize the interconnectivity and the power asymmetry, and they say that, look, if we really want to address sustainability issues, then SES, social and ecological system, provides a very good framework to handle that. What is basically, they talk about cross-scale dynamics, non-linearity, uncertainty, and emergent behaviors. So that is fascinating, and that really prepares us in a way to fix the hard challenge which we are facing. And Belinda and Elena, in their paper, they are certainly talking about adaptive learning and equitable partnership. They go on saying that people-planet relationship must be in the center of development, design, and implementation. And this, they talk about that many of the impacts of the nature are non-linear. Their reaction is in the loop, and if we see them in static linear framework, probably we are going to fail in achieving the sustainable development goals or the sustainability targets manifested through different indicators. So this is the context. Now, I know the time is very short, so I will come straight away, and being a typical economist, I would suggest that let's have the solution or the approach in three terms: in the short run, medium run, and the long run. I mean, we have to prioritize. We can, I mean, all the ideas are fascinating. They must be done, and they have merit. But to go to a policymakers, we have to give them the list that, look, this is in the short run, do now, then next, and then next. And then again, it is not a comprehensive list. It is just based upon these papers and all 12 papers which Adam and David have referred to. Number one, in the short run, in order to make peace with nature and avoid some of the pitfalls of planetary crisis, we must assess, quantify, internalize, and showcase those impacts, both malign and benign, into the development design. When I say development design, it should be at the practical level, whether it is fiscal policy, whether it is monetary policies, whether it's trade design, it is approaches towards demographics in every contours of the development designs and policy. They must be internalized. Of course, there will be a challenge on the unit scale, measurement, but that is secondary. So this should be the goal. Second, under short run, should be that we have to supplement how we measure progress. We have seen some of the remarks by fellow panelists that we need to move beyond GDP. Absolutely. I mean, GDP is good in certain sense. GDP is good for which it was designed after the World War II. But if we also use GDP for measuring progress and sustainability, we are in trouble. And one of the things which UNEP especially and other UN agencies are very particular that instead of banking on flow GDP, we should measure the assets or the stock or the wealth. And that is where, if you allow me, I would like to show you one slide with you. If you can see this, this is the global trends of the wealth for 163 countries of the world. And you can see that you have this is for period 91 to 2019. You have GDP per capita. You have wealth, inclusive wealth per capita, which is basically produced capital, natural capital, and human capital. So you sum it and then you get inclusive wealth divided by the number of people. And of course, you have human capital and all per capita basis. You will see the two things I would like to highlight, and that will also tell you many of you who have raised your concern in your respective papers. Number one, you can see that natural capital per capita is the only thing for 163 countries which is on decline for this 91-2019 period. All others are on rise. Their rate is different, but they are on rise. So that is one. Second, you will see that inclusive wealth per capita and GDP per capita, they are different. So wealth, the rate of growth of wealth per capita is lower than the rate of growth of GDP per capita. What does it mean? It means that we are misusing economic science and treating wealth as income. That is very bad economics. We should, the moment we do, we are jeopardizing the prospect of meeting sustainability and related goals. So we should not mix income with wealth. And I have seen few papers, certainly Jason's, also Belinda and Elena, and two other papers talking about it very specifically, that there is a need to move beyond GDP. So yes, we need to move beyond GDP. In the short run, we can supplement it but eventually we have to move beyond GDP and talk about wealth part. In the medium run, of course, we have to, that goes in the short run as well. We have to develop a nature and economic inequality nexus. As you know, after the COVID, we have lost 22 years. We have gone back to the level of 1999. And that we need to check. So that nexus must be put upfront, whether it is poverty and biodiversity, poverty and climate, poverty and pollution. That nexus should come very clearly. That can be done in medium run and even in the short run. Also, we have to develop risk assessment capacity and monitoring now and in the medium run. But what I'm saying in the long run, the designing of policy must recognize the social and ecological system very, very clearly. If we don't do that, what Belinda and Elena are saying, we are in deep trouble. So we have to gear ourselves towards that. Only request that if in the subsequent revision, Belinda and Elena can help us, that how they, what are the operational guidelines on accounting SES in the decision-making process, where exactly and how they map the social ecological system into decision-making units. That will be hugely important and useful for the policymakers. I think there can be many things, but these are few of the tip of the iceberg. I thought I will share it with you, but all the papers, 12 and this 4, are really fascinating, and that is what we should be doing in 50 years celebration of 1972 Stockholm meeting. Thank you very much. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you for those interventions. I think the points that you made and the papers that you highlight really push us to and illuminate the point that this question of the human environment relationship should push us to actually think about and actually do things differently when it comes to growth, sustainable development, and even conflict. And thank you for those policy solution reflections. I think all of this is incredibly important. So next up, I would like to pass the floor to Elizabeth Selwood, who is the Chief of the Environment and Security Unit at the UN Environment Program. So please feel free to take the floor.
Thank you, Margot, and thanks, David and Adam and colleagues for organizing this amazing collection of papers and this great meeting. I'm going to focus my comments mainly on Adam Frank's paper, Astrobiology of the Anthropocene. I'm the head of the Environmental Security Unit, so my work at the UN Environment Program is mostly focused on very immediate and crisis situations, and I find it incredibly useful to be pulled out and to look at the situation as Adam does, from the solar system perspective, to try and highlight some of the longer term issues that we're all trying to address. So two big points from the paper and from my work. One is how little time we have to become highly organized. Adam Frank says in his paper, the questions we humans need to understand is what has to happen on any planet that develops a long-term sustainable technological civilization, because that is the step we must take. What it is that has to happen, where we need to get to in order to develop a long-term sustainable technological civilization, because we're clearly not there yet, and we have to take that step. And also drawing lessons from the solar system and from modeling by Adam Frank and his colleagues. He warns that only those species that are smart enough to understand what is happening once their planet's climate change begins and take appropriate action will be those that endure. So it's a call to all of us to get organized, because we're clearly not organized yet and we have limited time. And just to say that I'm acutely aware of the challenges of getting organized to address some of the risks that we're facing, because most of my work is on environment and climate issues in conflict-affected contexts, where there is either no government or weak government, or also when there are contests between weak governments and stronger governments, for example, over natural resources. And often those tensions, those imbalances make it much more difficult for us collectively to achieve optimal outcomes of the kind that Adam Frank calls for in his paper. And we won't succeed in addressing these challenges collectively unless we intensify our efforts to work in those contexts, in those very complicated, messy, conflict-affected contexts. And Janani has set out some very good practical steps in her paper about how to do that. Three points about how this dialogue, this set of papers helps us to think about how to move forward and how to be more effective in addressing these challenges. First, I think the papers highlight the importance of interdisciplinary work, of cooperation between different knowledge strands, and also, of course, of multilateralism, which is a key part of Stockholm+50. UNEP has a very special role here. We have a science to policy mandate, and a lot of our work is trying to take the key lessons from the relevant science and then bring them into policy discussions at many different levels. But I think the papers also highlight this is not just about science, it's not just about technology, it's also about identifying relevant traditional practices, looking to the past, using archaeology as a way to guide us towards sometimes very ancient practices which humans have used to manage water, to restore land. Some of those practices are highly relevant to the situation we face now. They're highly workable. We've used them before, and often we need a combination of science and long-standing practices to make the difference on the ground. And another point that Adam Frank makes in his paper is about using storytelling to communicate to those whose behavior we're trying to change. Adam Frank says to be successful, we need a new story of life, Earth, and the human prospect. We have lots of very powerful tools that we're using to communicate solutions to specific environmental problems that we're facing. We have hydrological models, we have climate projections that can help us to understand where things are heading, but we're also using lots of different communications practice, including the development of plausible storylines to make future pathways and different adaptation options real, visible, to secure buy-in from a range of stakeholders. And these stakeholders, as colleagues have said on this call, are various, sometimes young people, sometimes the private sector, business, government partners, but we also need to convince those who need to shift, big investments, those who are responsible for making decisions about climate finance, to shift from business as usual and invest in some of the solutions that we know are incredibly powerful, but require imagination and require real shift in practice. Land restoration is one of them. There's huge potential there, but because large-scale land restoration hasn't happened in so many contexts, there's a real need for imagination to convince investors that that's going to work. Finally, a word about the positive agenda. Adam and David make the point in their paper that rather than trying to turn soft commitments into more enforceable restrictions on climate, they ask whether a system of incentives and reward-based choice architecture might work better. I think we know from long experience that that incentives are incredibly powerful, and we need to figure out how best to use them in order to push governments and investors in the right direction here, and individuals, obviously. And secondly, a quick point about multilateralism and the careful division of labor. As I said at the beginning, we don't have time, and we need to work very, very closely with different disciplines, both from science, from the academy, and deep into the practitioner community, different parts of the UN system, and different knowledge sources. And it's very welcome to see these issues being brought up in the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. I think there's a lot that we can do to refine and enhance the division of labor within the UN and beyond on tackling some of these immense climate challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. You summed up a lot of the key points really nicely here, and that works well because we will be passing it over to the authors next to react to all of these interventions. And we'll ask the authors I'll be calling on you and to intervene for about 5 minutes or so. But before I do, I also want to remind our audience to please feel free to use the Q&A function, as we hope to have some time in the end to answer your questions. So to start us off, we have Professor Belinda Reyers, who is a professor of sustainability science at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and the senior advisor at the Bejer Institute of Ecological Economics in Sweden. And also Professor Lena Bennett, who is the research chair in sustainability science at McGill University. They co-wrote their paper together. And to start us off, we will have Professor Belinda Reyers.
Thanks so much, Margot, and thanks to all of you, David and Adam and Margot, for finding some sense and connection between all of these very disparate voices. And I think, as Margot and Nanjala said right in the beginning, a lot of this is about pointing to the need to do things differently. You know, whatever we're doing, we need to do it differently. And I think a central theme across these contributions is that ultimately transformations to sustainability will depend on our collective capacities to place human-environment relationships at the forefront of sustainable development efforts, not only to make these relationships visible, but to actually reimagine and reshape them for more sustainable and just futures. And I think the point we're trying to make in our contribution is that these relationships between humans and environment don't only exist at the local scale or even just at the global scale. They connect sectors, they connect scales, and they connect places in complex and ever-changing ways. And one only has to look back at the last 2 or 3 years to realize how hyper-connected we are, not just socially connected, but through our interactions, impacts, and relationships with multiple environments. And so we argue in our contribution, Elena and I, that accounting for these dynamic cross-scale relationships moves us now beyond the last 50 years of sustainable development approaches that have largely treated sectors and scales and places as isolated. It also moves us beyond simplistic approaches that treat scale as additive, the sort of implicit assumption that if we achieve peace in 90% of all countries and territories, we will have achieved 90% of global peace. You know, that isn't necessarily how scale works. Similarly, a small intervention in one place can have massive implications and ramifications as it ripples around the world. You know, so we really need to move beyond this isolationist and additive approach to scale or even multi-scale. Leaving anyone behind is not only unjust, it also risks leaving everyone behind. And so in this hyper-connected time we live in, if we account for these human-environment relationships, it becomes clear that we can't choose a policy or an action if that's good for development and bad for the environment. If it's bad for the environment, it will be bad for development at some other time, in some other place, or for some other group. And so we really argue that as sustainable development moves ahead after this 50-year commemoration, we have to start explicitly making visible and accounting for these relationships across scales. As Pushbam says, we look to fields such as social ecological systems, but also to other knowledge systems and practices to highlight novel avenues. We found some sustainable development indicators that are emerging from Indigenous and community monitoring systems that actually track the condition of the relationship connecting people and nature, not tracking the condition of nature or tracking the condition of people, but tracking that relationship. And these monitoring systems don't treat the social and the ecological parts as separable, but focus on what connects them. And we look at many other examples of approaches and exciting avenues that are emerging in research and practice. And I think a lot of this could be very useful, for example, in the area of climate change adaptation, where the focus remains on the symptoms at a local scale, ignoring these multi-scalar, entangled social ecological pathways that have led to the vulnerability, marginalization, and degradation we see in the climate change adaptation arena. And so we point to some lessons from that space and also argue for some novel approaches that don't focus on burden shifting to the local scale, but turn the mirror back on ourselves and ask how we can change our learning, our knowledge practices as funders, as researchers, as the policy community, to really better account for these cross-scale interactions and the hyper-connected reality of the world we live in. I'm going to hand over to Elena, who's also just going to add a few comments, and then back to you.
Thanks, Belinda. Just really wanted to say one additional thing, and I think you really nicely pointed out that we are learning that we cannot separate by scale or by sector or by place, that there are enough interconnections that trying to do so when we create policies comes back to bite us in the end. And so as we turn this mirror on ourselves, I just wanted to touch on this idea of people-nature relationships at the center, just to add that one of the things that we wrote about was that people-nature relationships aren't a machine. If they were a machine, you could adjust one part, fix one gear, separate out by scale or by sector or place. And one of the things that I think that we're learning, and that comes through in many of the other papers as well, is that there are too many emergent behaviors in individuals, in societies, and in the relationship between societies and individuals and nature, to treat people-nature relationships like a machine. So, as we move forward, as we are motivating people to do amazing things, as Daniel said earlier, I think one of the things that comes through in our paper is that it's really important to remember that people are motivated by hope, by possibility, and by relationships with each other and by relationships with nature. And I will leave it there and turn it back over.
Great, thank you both for those great interventions. And next up, we have Professor Jason Hickel, who is a professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So Jason, feel free to take the floor. Jason, you might be on mute.
Here I am. Okay, sorry. I really don't have very much to say. I'd really like just to say thank you to the organizers for bringing us all together and for inspiring us and organizing this, the texts and the session. Also to the panelists for their wonderful contributions, and especially to Pushbam for his thoughts on my paper, and then also to all the other authors whose papers I loved and contributed a lot to my own thinking. So I really appreciate you all. I don't have much to add to what the panelists had to say and what I've written myself, except to say that it's been interesting over the past several years to watch the idea of degrowth gain such extraordinary traction in scientific circles, and increasingly find its way into public discourse as it has today. That's fascinating to me to see. And I've often remarked on the fact that there's this extraordinary divergence really between the dominant political discourse on climate mitigation strategy in high income nations, which focuses almost exclusively on technology, and what scientists are saying in the peer-reviewed literature, which focuses on, yes, technology, but also let's change the way that we approach production and the objectives of the economy. And I think that it's hard for me to imagine, it's hard for me to think of an example of a greater disjuncture between policy and science in any other realm. And my hope, I guess, for the coming decade and really the coming few years is that we find ways to bridge that divide and bring these crucial and new ideas from science into policymaking in order to achieve a just transition and rapid reduction of carbon emissions in rich countries. But with that, I'll leave it to the rest of the authors. I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jason. I think that's a really important point in terms of bridging the science and policy making divide. And a lot of the articles really speak to the lack of political will. And I just want to highlight the comment that Daniel just made in the chat in terms of the big issues being about behavior, ethics, political will, and courage. So I think that's definitely a key theme here. So next, I would like to pass the floor off to Dr. Ayed Abu-Mobli, who is the founder and director of the Faith for Earth initiative.
Thank you, Margot, and thanks to everybody, the reviewers, and of course, UNU for organizing this. I have been enjoying the feedback, which it's, collectively we're saying the same thing. And we're agreeing that technology, science alone wouldn't do the trick in facing the problems that we are handling today. I would like to make a point that I have not included in the paper because I'm trying to avoid controversy, which is through history, when there are many complex issues or corruption on Earth, through history, the stories and so on, a prophet or a philosopher emerges to provide ethical approaches to these problems and to guide, nations and peoples into more prosperous and into living in harmony with one another and with their surrounding. I'm not calling for a prophet to be ordained nowadays, because we have a wealth of religions that have existed over centuries and collectively can offer an excellent knowledge-based and tradition-based solutions to the problems of today. So I do agree with Dan, who mentioned the need for the knowledge aspects of religions to be brought forward and to work with the scientific knowledge that exists today and offer a collective approach towards solving these issues. Multilateralism, as mentioned by everybody, is our only solution. No one nation can address these complex issues. But multilateralism, doing it the same way we have been doing it, without including the powerful and knowledge-based and ethically based structures, existing structures, will be void of comprehensiveness. So the religious institutions, religions, and faith actors do provide that additional new approach to considering not only technology and science alone, but adding to it an ethical-based or value-based systems. And we know, and the science tells us, if we believe in science, the science tells us that belief systems do impact behaviors. And we know that the current problems of the day are mainly due to unsustainable consumption and production. So we need to integrate those value systems into the social or societal behavior, individual behaviors, institutional behaviors, so we can address all of these issues. We have seen that so many international agreements have been agreed with a low level of implementation. We have seen so many conferences, so many policies have been adopted. but keeping, addressing the issues the same way we address them will only solve some of the problems, but not the problems that we are facing today. So the perspective of religions, values, ethics, whether they are religious or religiously based or environmentally based, I'm calling for the emergence and convergence of both systems of ethics into the way we handle all of these issues. Certainly, it is not only the knowledge of religions or religious actors, but also, as mentioned by Natalia, the indigenous people, the cultural knowledge. And we know in Agenda 21, culture was one of the main pillars for sustainable development. However, unfortunately, it was dropped out when the Sustainable Development Goals were formulated, and culture has been integrated in all of the SDGs, but have not been given the prominence that it requires. Daniel also mentioned, how the different religions relate to the SDGs. And of course, you know about Laudato Si, the biblical, the encyclical letter by Pope Francis, and Al-Mizan, which has been developed by Islamic scholars from around the world. They actually touch upon the SDGs. Laudato Si, or the Vatican, has even come up with Laudato Si development goals, not to replace the Sustainable Development Goals, but to be some sort of an implementing contributor to the Sustainable Development Goals that we know of. What I am calling in the paper is we need to rethink our relationship with the environment and our problems, and reconcile the relationship. Today, this morning, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stressed that humanity is waging war on nature. So we need to reconcile our relationship, our superiority thinking in dealing with natural resources, to living in humility with nature. We cannot live without nature. We depend on nature, but we have nature-based solutions. We have nature limits that we need to respect and work within. We're not saying that growth should be slowed, but growth should be ethical growth. GDP cannot anymore continue measuring our growth, as Pushma mentioned, in many ways. It has to be a measure or accountability measures integrating the rights of nature and the rights, the spiritual connections between humans and nature and the environment. A last point, the convergence of two powers, the power of science and the power of religion, is very important. We have seen how religious actors have always, in all of their statements, mentioned or referred to scientific findings of IPCC, IPBES, and different conventions and scientific findings. However, we see scientists shying away from dealing with religious actors, although there are some articles, as Daniel mentioned, connecting religions to science, but that needs to be empowered, needs to be institutionalized, and we need to move forward together in a multilateral connection into addressing these issues. So I would stop here and would love to answer any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those interventions. So next up, we have Professor Adam Frank, who is a professor at the Helen F. and Fred H. Gowan in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Rochester. So Professor Adam Frank, please take the floor.
Well, like everyone, I want to first of all thank everyone for bringing this together. What David and Adam did with this, I was very surprised, when they contacted me. intrigued by the whole project. And I have to say, reading everyone's papers has been enormously helpful to me, because obviously the view I'm taking is, the 10,000 light year view. A criticism of the way I'm looking at it is that, like, well, what are we supposed to do with this 10,000 light year view? I'm always, my daughter is has gone into climate policy and works on, carbon, the ways carbon is measured for economic means. I'm very interested in, like, the boots on the ground part, and how the boots on the ground part of how the 10,000 policy initiatives that are going to be needed to actually build a sustainable future, how that connects with this larger view. In all of our papers, we were trying to rethink on different levels how people think and talk about climate. And so, it's interesting, the comment that David made about that, right, we're not really talking much about technology, because technology, that part's already on many levels. I mean, it's not solved, but we can see paths to how to change the energy technologies that are involved, that are rooted, that the problem is rooted in. It's the social systems, it's the power dynamics. And of course, with power dynamics, looking across history, people in power don't want to give up power. And if their power is rooted in a particular kind of wealth, i.e. fossil fuels, they're not going to want to give up on it. And so, really then what it falls upon is to kind of create a new story that everybody else is, imbibes, that allows that shift to happen, or forces the shift to happen. And so, many of these discussions, I think, have been really interesting for me. I will just, the idea of the social and environmental systems, of understanding. What's interesting to me here, and I won't belabor this point, is that in many ways we are handed a vision of nature, and a vision of the human relationship to nature that came from, the dawn of science, the Enlightenment, and the dawn of industrial production, the dawn of capitalism, which went hand in glove, right? There's really, there's some really interesting new research in looking at how science and capitalism were closely interrelated. And when I say capitalism, I'm going to throw socialism and communism in there too. It was modes of production that were extractive from the environment. Nature was just something out there, and you could do whatever you wanted to it. And science, and it basically treated all living systems as machines, essentially. And if you just turn the knobs in the right way, everything will be fine. And what's interesting, and so that gave us a whole view of political economy and our relationship to nature, in which nature was something that could be pushed off, or something basically you dumped your garbage, basically. And every mountain was only valuable to the extent that you could get commodities out of it that could be priced and measured. But what's interesting is science has gone past that, right? The rise of complex systems, we now have a very different view, or have the possibility of a very different view about how living systems, and that includes social systems, are formulated. And it's not at all, the machine metaphor does not work. It's the wrong metaphor. So in many ways, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get maybe the narrative that we have about nature to catch up with some of what we're learning about science. But of course, that actually, in the way, there's a turning around and a going backwards. I completely agree about the role of religion, because science will never tell you what you should do. That's about values, and values are, what we value is something that's about what's sacred to us, and that's a wholly other regime that science is not going to be able to address. So just to conclude, it's very much about the stories we tell, and if we're really going to make progress, and I don't know exactly how to do this, this is why I wanted to be part of this, is changing the stories we tell through the policies we enact, through the stories we tell to people about why we're enacting these policies, but also creating the larger framework, which again, every aspect of human civilization, and religion powerfully, is going to have to play a role in giving us a new story about our relation, our being embedded in nature. Because if we're at a war with nature, we're going to lose.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think all these papers really offer a way to change the narrative about how we see ourselves with the environment. And I thought your paper, especially in terms of really zooming out and seeing it in the solar system perspective, really brought that kind of perspective and that analysis on the narrative into a new way. So thank you for that. And next up, we have Professor Crucial Watene, who is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at Massey University in Otoria in New Zealand. So Professor Crucial Watene, please feel free to take the floor.
Ngā mihi mai o hā kia koutou I tēnei hui, he uri no Ngāti Manu, te hikatu Ngāti Whātua Ora kei me Tonga. Kia ora everyone, I'm dialing in from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My communities are mainly in the north of New Zealand and also the Pacific Island nation of Tonga. So I thought, I'm very grateful, of course, to everyone that's been involved in this wonderful project, actually, and event, and the discussion has been wonderful so far. So I just wanted to say a few things, and then I wanted to sort of engage with some of the discussants, if that's okay. So one of the things I say in my paper is that the fundamental challenge is to find the courage to look beyond our existing conceptual foundations. And so the reason for that, which I think we all agree with, is that our current thinking is unable to solve the challenges that we face because that thinking wasn't designed to deal with these challenges, right? So we can't just tinker with the existing conceptual foundations or the infrastructure. If we don't transform those infrastructures, we'll just enable more of the same thinking in our reforms, right? So that's a problem. And so I think part of the answer is to be honest about the kinds of questions that we need to ask ourselves. Things like, well, what should we want from our theories of justice? What should we want from our theories of well-being? From our theories and practices of development, of economic development even. You know, what do we need from those theories and practices given the challenges that we and our descendants face? And can those theories and practices really give us what we need right now? Right? And I think we have to be really honest about the answers there. And I think those answers help us to get a sense of what, in terms of my paper, intergenerational justice requires of us now. It helps us to figure out how we take people and communities as agents of change and transformation in their own right, how we take them with us, how it helps us to answer how we motivate responsibility taking in ways that capture what it is that we have reason to value, to use Amartya Sen. It also helps us to see that there's a rich tapestry or network of ideas that can help us here. Indigenous philosophies and the communities in which these philosophies flourish can be found in every part of the world. And there are more than just Indigenous communities and Indigenous philosophies, of course, that build this vibrant network too, and all these vibrant stories that we have. So recognizing this network of ideas and empowering these communities is an important part of that solution and to finding the answers to those questions, right? I just wanted to mihi to Daniel. I loved the idea of turning YOLO on its head, a fantastic way of putting it. That we get a chance to leave something that our descendants find worth remembering, right? I think that's a fascinating way of putting it. Thank you very much. Also, Jasmina, I absolutely agree with your point about the role of our young people for inspiring and charting change and our belief in their aspirations and power. And I think that part of the challenge is to transform our epistemic infrastructures, the infrastructures that enable and empower communities. I also think children face a particular, it reminded me, your point about children, that they face a particular kind of epistemic injustice, right? A particular kind of injustice that concerns the ability to be treated equally as a knower, as a knowledge holder, right? So this relates to other forms of injustice too, of course, distributive injustice and things like the unfair distribution of epistemic goods. But this idea really helps to recognize the way that we can be discriminated against in our capacity as knowers, and how particular communities and members of society, young people in this case, are vulnerable in this regard. And I think that relates also to what Poonam also said. I absolutely agree that we need systematic inclusion of underrepresented groups more generally, and part of that is the need to transform, again, our epistemic infrastructures to allow for the inclusion of these voices and knowledges, not just in real and meaningful ways, but also as an issue of justice, of epistemic injustice in its own right. And I also think that stronger bonds between young people and elders and young people in the state, just going back to what Jasmina said, ngā mihi to you, is an important part of that epistemic infrastructure and redesigning it as well. So kia ora, thank you so much for all the wonderful comments. Ngā mihi.
Thank you so much, Chriselle. I think a key theme throughout all of the interventions is the need to really rethink how the multilateral system is supporting or not supporting this rethinking of the human environment relationship. So your point on, the need we don't need just to tinker with it, but really there's a need for transformational change is a really important one. So thank you. And so next up, we have Professor Workine Kelbesa, who is a professor of philosophy at Addis Ababa University. So Professor Workine Kelbesa, please feel free to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Allow me to share my brief summary. So I've enjoyed all the presentations, and in my paper, I try to look at first the origin of Western environmental ethics and varieties of environmental ethics, indigenous perspectives, and so forth. Environmental ethics and philosophy particularly began in the 1970s because of environmental crisis. In the past, people think that science and technology alone can address all problems. But in the 1970s, that was no longer possible, because philosophers try to indicate that first and foremost, we have to examine our values, our attitude toward the environment, and try to make a fundamental shift. So that is the most important point. And again, as some of our colleagues stated, non-Western traditions have also paid attention to environmental issues. I just took African environmental ethics. African environmental ethics examines the relationship between human beings and the natural environment, and environmental ethics and environmental policy making. Environmental ethics has made important contribution to conservation biology, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the Earth Charter, and the constitutions of Ecuador and Chile in one way or another. And again, recently, various countries recognized the right to clean environment. We might say that in one way or another, they have been influenced by some of the views of philosophers. And ethics can also contribute to climate change litigation. And individual environmental philosophers have also made important contribution to, among others, IUCN, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, UNESCO, COMET, the Council for Scientific Knowledge and Technology. We can mention a number of individuals who have contributed to this. The problem is very few people understand the views of philosophers. And there is a kind of misunderstanding. Some say that philosophy has nothing to do with environmental issues, practical issues. That is not the business of philosophy. Others say that environmental ethics is too practical, too applied, therefore we may not benefit from this, but that is really wrong. But environmental ethics is very, very useful because it influenced policymakers, although there are some misunderstandings. So because of this, we can say that environmental ethics can contribute a lot. So some people say that an individual cannot make any contribution, but individuals can make a number of contributions because setting an example is very important. Each person has contributed to climate change, we can say that. So according to some, John Brume, those who deny the fact that an individual can cause harm is considered as individual denialists. So because of this, therefore, it is important to try to contribute our own fair share. So philosophers are required to continue to tell the truth and counter false ideas. There is one important African proverb which I would like to mention, called, if you think you are too small to make a difference, you shouldn't spend a night with a mosquito, of course. So this indicates our collective responsibility and at the same time our individual responsibility. So let me conclude because of time constraints. In my paper, I argued that Western environmental ethics and African environmental ethics are complementary. So both stated that the world was not made for us. Therefore, it is the basis of our survival. And because of this reason, therefore, we need to use multiple perspectives to deal with the burgeoning local and global environmental challenge, precisely because there is no one single solution to various environmental problems. One single country alone cannot solve various global and local environmental problems. So as some of our contributors today and our colleagues in their paper stated, it is important to engage with scientists, policymakers, indigenous people, peasant farmers, and so on and so forth, and try to raise awareness. And at the same time, as some of our presenters today indicated, we should also focus on students, on the young people. And children should be encouraged to think creatively and critically, and to take their own action to take environmental issues, to understand both intrinsic and instrumental values from the very beginning. So finally, I would like to argue that both indigenous and modern environmental ethics education should be given to students at primary and higher levels. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rakine, for those interventions. I think it also really speaks to this key theme of behavior change and how philosophy and religion, as we've discussed, can really be there to influence values and therefore influence behavior. So it's a really critical point. And next up and last for our authors, we have Professor Maritza Paredes, who's the Associate Professor in Social Sciences and the Director of the PhD program in Sociology at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. So Professor Maritza Paredes, please feel free to go up next. You're still on mute, Maritza, just so you know. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Margot, and thank you very much to all for the comments. I want also to thank David and Adam for the opportunity of be part of this group. I have learned quite a lot and enjoy reading all the papers. I think they are really great contributions. And I also think that I want to thank the system of the UN to open to support this discussion and the disponibility and the opportunity, as Belinda said at the beginning, of thinking things differently. I don't have much to say and to add to what my colleagues have already mentioned. However, I would like to emphasize that behind the problem, seeking to solve this global climate crisis and the solutions we try to implement, it is an issue of power, as many of you have mentioned, and inequality in the access to this power. And I think in our paper, we try to mention and to highlight that while it has been very important for us to recognize this as a global problem, and many of my colleagues, partners of this group have emphasized that, in the paper we also want to emphasize that the problem is seen from different perspectives and realities globally. So the territories are ways to also to understand that we are in this all together, but we also are not in the same conditions, and we are also not facing the same specific problematics and challenges. So the paper have tried to draw attention to these multiple voices from territories, and these are reactions to sometimes ways of thinking this climate crisis and their solutions as homogeneous and no diversified experiences and problems. And I think just want to finish saying that to try to change ways of thinking about this, we also need to change our ways to thinking about how we participate in this. And probably, although this is a very difficult problem because we're used to participate and to think representation, particularly political representation, in a very conventional ways, and it is very difficult to change that. I agree that we need to be very creative to bring the voices and the representations of marginal peoples in different ways, in forms that are alternative to traditional politics, to have something to say about the solutions and the impacts of these solutions also in their specific and territorial lives. So thank you very much for having me in this group and for this really great opportunity.
Said. I think that's such a great note to end on in terms of, again, this idea of the importance of really bringing in a diverse set of voices into these issues, as it's deeply human and affects everyone very differently, but very powerfully. So thank you to you, and thank you to all of the authors, as well as the experts who intervened today. And now I would love to kick off the Q&A with Professor Adam Day, who is the head of office at the UNU-CPR in Geneva, to ask a question to the panelists. And then I invite everyone who's attending here today to use the Q&A function in the panel, and we'll get through as many questions as we can.
Thanks so much, Margot, and great job moderating us today. We spent a lot.
You just went on mute, Adam.
David muted me. That's probably some sort of underlying issue between us. No, just to say, David and I spent a lot of time with these authors. We're so excited to be seeing them in action here today. And I actually don't want to talk about the two papers that David and I wrote. You can read them if you'd like. They're on the site, where we try to capture some of the common themes and also offer some thoughts about moving towards action. But I'd actually much rather hear from the authors. One of the key points that seems common across them is this need for radical change. And Jason, some of your work really talks about reevaluating capitalism, reimagining how debt structures need to be dealt with. Belinda and Elena, you talk about multi-scalar forms of global governance that would really constitute a major change in the way we think about global governance. And Krishil and Yad and Louis all talk about a new set of norms and ethics and laws, which would really, if they came about, would constitute huge shifts in how international law and rights might be reimagined. Maritza, you were just talking about really a very different perspective on how rights and duties might be reimagined through Indigenous experiences. We're all sitting here in Stockholm, which has the word action about 70 times in its opening statement. And many of us are really struggling with how to move from these ideas into action. What does the next 3 days, 6 months, 5 years look like? And that really seems, it can get fuzzy quite quickly. And I was wondering if any of you authors have any sense about what would be the best next steps to catalyze action. What kind of incentives could be baked into the system? What kinds of experiences from your own areas can you point to that have showed the capacity for change in systems? And what really can we be inspired by? Adam, Frank, you talked a bit about stories. Are there stories that we can draw from to really start catalyzing action and not have another 15 to 20 cop flops or more talk shops? So that's really my question to any of you who would like to respond to it to get started with our remaining time. Thank you.
If I could just jump in, somebody's looking to jump in. I'm wondering, one thing that is of interest to me, for the rest of the panelists, is the idea of different scales, right? It can become so frustrating, especially for young people, to sort of engage with the activity, with the governance and see nothing happen, right? Because if you're asking for things to happen at the largest scale, that's the most difficult scale to happen. But as I tell students, especially over the last few years, who coming to me, being very depressed, I'd say, look, it's about voting, and they'd be like, oh, that just seems like what, voting every 4 years? I was like, no, voting every day. There's always, on a local level, there's water board meetings, and there's everything that your little town is doing. But I just would be interested in how, especially when we think about scale, how might we see things moving from small scales upward, or at least being able to gain enough control locally or have an influence locally that you can keep that inspiration happening and having it actually have some effect.
Belinda, feel free to take the floor.
Great. Not that I pretend to know to tell people what they should do tomorrow, but I think in the work that we've done reviewing what's actually happening on the ground in practice, and by practice I don't mean practical and technical, I mean the kinds of processes and changes that you see in local NGO and locally led work, there are these amazing pockets of innovation which are radically different from what we were seeing in development and sustainable development practice 50 years ago. But I think, as Adam, you were saying, they tend to bump their heads up against, the larger institutional or global barriers that prevent that type of innovation. And so, I think what Elena and I also write about is a little bit the way we need to change the way we think about going to scale. We always think global problem requires global solution. And I think that that's one of the things we really need to start thinking differently about. And Michelle Limwe in her work talks about the need to scale out, up, and deep as a very different way to approach this idea of going to scale. So I would suggest there's some of those ways that we can do our work very differently, and at least within the UN system, really challenge these ways of thinking about scale and the global scale problems of sustainable development. Thanks.
Thank you. And Rukine, feel free to take the floor next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As I've already stated, most of the time during meetings like this and international conferences, we usually make a number of slogans. We have to do this, we have to do that, and so on and so forth. But practically in the real world, it is very difficult to translate those slogans into practice because of the power structure in the current world order. Unless otherwise we address global injustice, global power structure, it will turn out to be difficult for the coming 50 years to address various development and environmental challenges. Therefore, particularly the public should be conscious and should try to force their governments to address global environmental issues. And as you know, most of the time, politicians don't think beyond one election term. So they try to influence their own people. And because of that, they are not very much interested in long-range global environmental issues, global development issues, and so forth. Therefore, if you raise awareness, if you instill environmental values in the public, that will be very, very helpful. So what we should do, therefore, we should try to address global injustice and at the same time try to encourage indigenous people and the young people, peasant farmers, pastoralists around the world to be part and parcel of development and environmental programs and solutions. Because if you don't rely on their own knowledge and you simply impose our knowledge, the so-called modern knowledge, scientific knowledge on the local people, the final result will be negative. Therefore, we should accommodate the views of indigenous people, the views of local people, and at the same time, the so-called modern science. So both indigenous knowledge and modern knowledge will be helpful to address the global environmental issues. But finally, as I've already indicated, we should try to force our governments to be accountable and to address global environmental issues and to go beyond their own economic and national interests and address global problems. Thank you very much. That is what I would like to say.
Thank you so much for those responses to the question. I'm seeing Maritza just popped up, so feel free to intervene. Yes.
Thank you, Margot. I'm just was thinking that Adam's idea of narratives are very suggestive, especially if we bring to the table like very diverse, even ambiguous or different and contradictory narratives, because perhaps we need chaos first before finding a new order, a new way, an alternative form of see things. Sometimes we try to accommodate different narratives in one single narrative, and that's part of the problem. And if we bring these narratives out in the way they are experienced, sometimes without probably having a common path, in this chaos, we can find creatively new ways of doing things. And I think that talks a little bit of what Belinda just have said, is looking scale in different ways. But we need to hear this narrative without our minds trying to accommodate them in a single narrative. And that can be very helpful from women, from young people, from indigenous people, from local farmers, sometimes very stigmatized, especially in the Andes, for example, illegal crops farmers, which are the enemies of the forests, no? But if we really listen to their stories and their narratives, we can understand what are the role in all these problems. That's it.
Thank you so much. And, really thank you everyone for such great interventions today. And before wrapping up, I wanted to give one last opportunity to the authors to share any final views that you may have, and then I will pass it over to David to close us off today. Alrighty, David, feel free to go. Oh, it looks like Adam might have one last, I see one last hand.
I was just hoping that you guys could find maybe another opportunity for us at some point to come together again and talk, maybe on something, some way. I think there was enough here that, if we could find some way, maybe even a smaller meeting, but to maybe begin to hash out certain issues might be useful. That's all.
You've opened up a path for my closing remarks, which is to say, I think in an earlier comment that you made, you said that the narrative needs to catch up to the science. The science won't tell us what to do. This is really a values question. And what we've heard in the conversation throughout the last 2 hours is how important behavior is, values, how we nudge people to behavioral change. And I think we have an opportunity, we have had an opportunity throughout this project to help develop that narrative. I think we've been a critical friend to the environment community and to the leaders that are gathering here in Stockholm. And I hope, Adam, that we will have an opportunity to continue working on that narrative after this event. So you will hear more from us on that. I would like to say just to surface one point from a paper that Adam and I wrote, and it's a theme that has also been present in the conversation today, and that is how important it is to have the right data to make the case and to tell our stories. I think at the heart of many of these issues is data about the challenges that we face. I think it's important for accountability, holding governments accountable, holding our leaders accountable. Data is important for empowering communities, indigenous communities, be it on land rights to demonstrate collective ownership and time that they have spent on their land, or simply for investment, the kinds of green investment that we want. I think we need to move away from our current approaches to data, the data monopolies that we see, the commodification of data, and start to think of data as a global public good in this space, and how we can use that data to help move forward and support our narrative. I want to close by acknowledging the invitation from the United Nations Environment Programme to us, the United Nations University, to curate this dialogue, to support you authors, your voices in the lead up to Stockholm+50, and for them having invited us into so many different steps along the way to try to shape the outcome documents. I think it demonstrates that the UN is listening to those who have asked for greater inclusivity, and I think it's a wonderful model of how to involve alternative voices and paradigms in an intergovernmental process. So warm thanks to our colleagues at UNEP for having invited us in. Warm thanks again to all the authors for having taken the time over the last few months to work with us, to share your ideas, to reshape your ideas, and to all our participants today for having joined us online. We will bring this to a close. We won't synthesize today's discussion, but we hope you will continue to follow this space as we work together on these issues. Thank you all very much, and good day, good night, wherever you are.
Thank you.